I'm here at Environmental Fence talking to Vito, the Plastics Program Manager, about plastic in the environment and what we need to know. So Vito, tell me first a little bit about your scope of work.
So well, the objective of this program is effectively to try to reduce plastic in Canada, but also looking internationally, and also trying to make sure that the plastic doesn't get to the environment, that plastic doesn't pollute more and more our, rivers and lakes, etc.
And how are you doing that?
There's two main components to our work. One is campaigning, so making sure that the public is also on board on plastic reduction. And the second thing is trying to influence decision makers, so the provincial government, municipal government, and also the federal government.
Let's talk about the federal government. Huge news in Canada recently that the federal government wants to ban single-use plastics. Can you tell us what that actually means? A lot of people are confused by what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, I understand the confusion because despite being a very good announcement, it was also at the same time very vague because the plan has several steps. That means that we don't really know what are the single-use plastics that will be banned, because not all single-use plastic will be banned, only a number of items.
How effective do you think banning plastic actually is in mitigating environmental pollution?
It's one of the steps that are necessary, in the sense that there's one big problem, which is there's way too much plastic. And we've always been told that recycling is a solution, but because we recycle as a society, and not only in Canada, only a small fraction of the plastic that we produce, that is not a real solution. So reduction is one. And one of the way of reducing is banning some plastics that are, let's say, not necessary. Let's say we can do without a plastic fork, or we can do without a plastic plate. There are alternatives, even reusable alternatives.
Sure, there sure are. When you talk about, or when a government, any government, we've seen a lot of governments in a lot of countries step forward recently to talk about banning single use. Does that mean that they're banning them at, let's say, restaurants aren't allowed to serve with them anymore? Or is it within the government offices? Like, what does a ban actually entail?
Yeah, well, so there are total bans. So for example, some of the plastics that are probably going to be banned are going to be plastic forks, maybe straws, apart from those that are needed for accessibility issues. Sticks, like stirrers, those plastics that are useless, and those will be completely banned in terms of putting them on a market. We shouldn't be able to find them in shops. We shouldn't be able to find them in restaurants, etc.
Got it. So that's actually a good thing.
Yes, that is a good thing, because imagine a plastic stirrer for a coffee or for a cocktail. We can really do without one. We can just use a spoon, for example, to stir. We don't really need to use a piece of plastic that then it's just thrown and discarded and stays in the environment for the next 500 years.
Yeah, it literally has a lifespan of a few seconds.
Literally, in this
terrible.
case, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about recycling. There's a lot of confusion around recycling, and I think that recycling is interesting because it really puts the onus on the consumer, and it takes the onus away from large companies. And there definitely has to be responsibility on both sides of the coin. But why are people not recycling properly? Is it because of confusion when it comes to your local municipality?
Again, I agree with the fact that we shouldn't put the blame on consumers, and I think consumers are doing the best they can. But it becomes very confusing, as you said. In my municipality, the list of what is accepted in the blue box changes periodically. There's so many packaging that have mixed materials, and I don't know if I should separate it, put some parts in the garbage and others in the blue box. I think it's extremely unfair that to clean up the mess of the corporation that choose to create those packaging, we need to take responsibilities without having a real incentive.
Sure, exactly. But I think that the consumer does play a really important part.
Yes, I mean, the consumers play a part when the rules are simple and when there's also an incentive. I think the greatest thing of trying to live, or minimize waste or living plastic free is the fact that it sends a signal, and a couple of signals. One is it's possible, it's satisfying, and it's also a demand, like to tell decision makers, like, we don't want this plastic, try to do something to get rid of it, to decision makers and also to producers.
Speaking of decision makers, I wanted to just touch on something that I find very, very interesting. When a government, any government, including the Canadian government, says, okay, we're going to ban plastic, single-use plastics, a lot of people on the opposition step forward and say, oh, this is going to cost consumers, this is going to cost us more money, oh my gosh, we're going to be paying more. But shouldn't we be paying more if we are part of polluting our environment? If you can afford to buy 5 coffees a day in a single-use coffee cup, you can afford to pay a little bit more.
That's a great point. On the one hand, it seems to be unfair that sometimes like plastic-free products are more expensive than packaged. Yeah. And it's all because of the economies of plastics. In terms of paying, taxpayers are already paying so much for the plastic. Imagine like all the litter that we have to pay to clean up. So over 80% of litter is made of plastic. And apparently Toronto alone spends $25 million a year to clean up litter. So make that an 80%, that's all what plastic is costing us. On top of that, over 80% of the plastic is going to landfills. So it means that taxpayer money are helping to collect that. Taxpayer money are paying for the landfills. And when the landfills fill up, because the plastic doesn't biodegrade, we will need more landfills, and that will be paid with taxpayer money. So in the end, we are paying.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy. So I wanted to talk to you about something called the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. So this is 28 companies, including Shell, Chevron, and other fossil fuel companies, and plastic packaging companies like P&G, which are the makers of Mr. Clean and Tide, Crest, Purex, Gliss, among others. So this seems to me, after reading and doing quite a bit of research on this, that this is literally pure greenwashing. I'd love you to comment on the Alliance to End Plastic Waste.
So the Alliance to End Plastic Waste is, it's a kind of a greenwashing and blame-shifting alliance. So the premise of this alliance is that the problem of plastic waste is all a developing countries issue, and they want to invest money in that. They have committed for what seems to be a considerable amount of money. I think it was $15 billion US dollars. But if you look at it in perspective, that's peanuts from what they're the money that they make in general from plastic. But what's more problematic about this alliance is really putting the blame on developing countries, like them pumping into these countries all this plastic products, all packaged, without them having having ever asked for these products, and not having a developed waste management system. But what's even worse in this alliance to end plastic waste is that is this shifting the blame, when in the first place, in developed country with very good waste management systems like Canada, like the US, like European countries, we are not able to even manage our own plastic. And we ship it to other countries and we don't manage to recycle it. So, it's really a way to not to solve the problem, but to say we're going to continue to make more plastic, and and we're going to try to manage this outcry from the public.
Yeah, there's a really interesting statistic on your website which says ExxonMobil is planning on doubling its production of polystyrene, which is PE, the most common plastic made to use things like plastic bags, films, containers, and other things we just simply don't need.
Yeah, it's clear that the plastic market is increasing, and it's predicted to double in the next 20 to 30 years. So the amount of plastic being produced. And if we consider that among all the plastic ever being produced, only 9% has been recycled. That means there's going to be a lot of plastic around. So the first step should really be trying to reduce that. But it's not easy. The fossil fuel industry is strong, and the fossil fuel industry also gets a lot of subsidies to make more plastic. And Canada does the same. Recently, Canada has given, both at the federal and provincial level, several million, and I'm talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, to companies to produce more plastics here in Ontario, in Sarnia, in Alberta, and more coming out.
I mean, that's very hard to hear and very disheartening because, you know, in my eco space and a lot of the people that follow me and my colleagues in this space are working tirelessly to try to educate people on the issues of plastic waste, trying to mitigate that by looking at more zero waste options, more reusable options. And it feels like sometimes all of the work that we are doing is for nothing when we know that the government is subsidizing plastic production. And the fact that plastic production is going to increase over the next 20 years makes it feel even worse. So what can we say to me and those people?
Well, I think the things you do are fundamental to show the way, right? Obviously, we need to have everybody on board, and the best way to have everybody on board is to make plastics, you know, the choice of plastic less convenient, like, so internalizing the cost. You were saying before, you know, who uses the plastic also has to bear the cost of it and pay for that pollution. Right now, it's who's suffering for it is the environment, and people that are struggling more to use less plastic or to go plastic free end up initially paying more, because like in my experience, like going plastic free has ultimately led to saving money rather than spending more money.
I agree. I think it's yes, you might spend, you know, $30 or $40 on a really good insulated reusable mug. You'll never have to spend that ever again.
Exactly.
You know, that lasts pretty much, if you take care of it, it can last a lifetime.
Absolutely.
Honestly. I also wanted to touch on recycling. So, but not recycling from a blue bin standpoint, more recycling from a larger manufacturing standpoint. So I was in India recently and saw firsthand what not having a proper waste management system in place, and we looked at and studied what waste pickers do in India, and a plastic organization known as Plastics for Change, which is actually the first ethically traded plastic, looking at going into environments and taking out specific bottles, mostly PET bottles that can be reused because they're food grade, can be reused at a level in beauty products as an example. And they're doing really great work there. But it seems to me like the plastic industry is more interested in producing more plastic as opposed to developing innovations around recycling the plastic that already exists in the environment. There's so much plastic in the environment, you know, we could pull a lot of that plastic out and reuse it for other things, including water bottles, shampoo bottles, toothpaste tubes, whatever it might be. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, if we think about it, what is the goal of the plastic industry?
Produce more plastic.
It's making more plastic. So recycling, it's, you know, if you think about recycling plastic, that means like for them, for the petrochemical industry, like, so the fossil fuel industry, which is exactly the same as the plastic industry, if reusing the resins, the plastics, it means for them making less money, and so like there's no incentive for them to push for these business models. And then there's also another thing. So you mentioned PET, like because that's a pretty good plastic. Like it's a plastic that it has a very low toxicity, if not toxic at all. It can be recycled several times. It does lose volume in recycling, but there's so many other types of plastics, right? And these other types of plastics they are really maybe the biggest problem. Like, if you look at recycling code, I always say avoid the 3, the 6, and the 7, because number 3 is PVC, and it often contains the worst toxic chemicals. Number 6 is polystyrene, and it's made with styrene, which is a chemical that is suspected of being, a health hazard. And then number 7, which is a mixed category, but it often includes plastics that contain bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disrupting chemical and can be problematic for health. So avoid those. The others are a bit better and easier to recycle. And in fact, here in Canada, we do a good job recycling those, like number 1, 2, and 5. But, the problems are mainly all the others.
Mainly all the others, yeah. I mean, it definitely seems that we are in a plastic crisis right now. And, I've been doing this for about 18 years, and I feel every day it's getting harder and harder for us to get out of this plastic crisis. And reading things where you see that the plastic industry is now increasing production, the increasing of production, doesn't the onus fall back on the consumer? Because if we weren't buying as much convenient products in plastic, would the industry be making as much plastic? Or is it not just what we're using, but through possibly manufacturing and other forms of plastic where it continues to be?
Well, I think that consumers respond to incentive, like everybody. So it means a match between the price and the convenience. If something that is cheaper is offered to us, or to us in general as human beings, as consumers, like most of the people will choose the cheaper product, unless we're value driven. And so I don't want to blame any consumer that goes for the cheaper and more plastic packaged product, because it's not their choice. Like, a lot of plastic is being imposed by us. A lot of demand, because that's also what companies say. Like, but this is what the consumer wants. I don't think the consumer ever asks for like all these huge amounts of water coming in plastic bottles. Like 30 years ago, bottled water was something that was not so common, and like, what's next? Bottling air, because water comes from something that we've invented a long time ago called like a tap, and it works pretty well, and it has like a very little carbon footprint.
Yeah, I mean, the carbon footprint of production of plastic I find, fascinating. There's the extraction point, extracting the petroleum from the earth and shipping it to another country to manufacture the plastic, then shipping it over here so that we can use the plastic for single use instead of just using a spoon.
Yeah.
Like, it's...
and imagine for the plastic, for the water, because I think it's like we need to rewire ourselves around that. Like, imagine how much water we buy coming from another country. Like, and it seems natural that this water has traveled across the ocean. Water coming from Italy, water coming from Fiji, or water coming from France. What's the point?
Exactly, that's the burning question. So in your line of work, well, before I want to ask you just a couple, to give us some tips, but I also wanted to just touch on microplastics, because I know there was a big report that came out recently that said that the average person is ingesting, I think it was about 50,000 pieces of microplastic every single year.
I reread that in a different light. It says you're ingesting as much as a credit card every week. Or every month.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Okay, so where is that mostly coming from? So I know that obviously it's if you're eating fish, and depending on where that fish comes from, you're certainly going to get microplastics from fish, because we know microplastics are probably a bigger issue in the ocean than single-use plastics because we can't see them. But where are other places that we might be ingesting them that we can protect ourselves?
At home.
So some examples?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of clothes are made of plastic. They're called something else. They're called nylon. They're called, polyester. But that's all plastic.
So any kind of synthetic fabric?
Any synthetic fabric, anything that is not cotton, cashmere, wool, or it's effectively plastics. And some, are losing their fibers more quicker than others, and so they just become dust at home. And the same happens with pretty much any plastic product. So when just being at home, and breathing the dust, that's a way to ingest plastic, because microplastic can be very tiny. So that can be one way of ingesting plastic, additionally to eating fish or other products that, or other animals that may have ingested plastic.
And I also read, or I've been looking at this topic, because fresh air, we can't really do much without fresh air. Like, we need fresh air to breathe. And there's a lot of research right now coming out on plastic in landfill and plastics in environments that are constantly off-gassing and pushing microplastics into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So it can happen, it seems like, in your home, as you mentioned, but also just outside in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, we always thought that plastic biodegrade at some point. But the science is supporting it's going in the direction of understanding that actually plastic may never completely biodegrade. It will always be around. Some plastic may take longer to break down than others, but they just only break down in smaller and smaller pieces and never go back and being part of of nature. And unfortunately, this is also true for many biodegradable plastics, or some plastics that are made from natural sources, not from fossil fuels, may not necessarily biodegrade. So it becomes a tricky market, the compostable biodegradable, because it's difficult to understand to which extent it's true that they actually disappear into the environment.
And how long does it take? Does it take 6 weeks, 6 days, 6 months? And does it need sun? Most things do need sun or soil. That's not affected by anything else.
Yeah. And the temperature.
Sure.
Like a lot of when we see compostable, it may mean that they compost, but they're not going to compost in your home composting facility. They're only going to compost in a municipal composting facility over a certain temperature, within a certain period of time. I know a lot of people that have bought compostable coffee pods, putting them in their composter. After 2 years, it's intact.
Yeah, and that's a great example, because the coffee pod people say their argument is, but they're compostable.
Oh yeah.
But when you actually put it to the test, and when you actually speak to people in the municipality, in your municipal area, they tell you, no, please don't put these in the compost bin, because they don't compost.
Exactly. So yeah, I think it's good to, in order to educate a bit more the public, is to try to understand this other greenwashing nuance between compostable and composted, biodegradable and biodegraded, and recyclable and actually recycled. So starting from this last one, the plastic industry says that every plastic is recyclable. And it's probably true scientifically in theory. The problem is that we know the majority of the plastic doesn't get recycled. And certain plastics are extremely expensive and difficult to recycle, like PVC, plastic number 3. It can take like thousands or hundreds of dollars to recycle, like just a ton of PVC, because of the chemical contamination, because it's so difficult to collect and to clean up and stuff like that. So what is important to know is what is actually recycled. What is important to know is what is actually composted. And what is important to know is what actually biodegrades, not what is theoretically biodegradable, compostable, recyclable.
And how do we know that? How do we figure that out as consumers?
It's not very easy. That's the reason why part of these announcements on how to tackle plastic pollution And that is true both for the federal government and for the provincial government in Ontario and all over Canada, is to shift to an extended producer responsibility system where the producers of the plastic have to take the responsibility also to collect it, to recover it, and to recycle it. And so ultimately it will be their responsibility to feed us or to sell us products that are actually recyclable. So we don't have the onus to know, okay, this is recyclable, but is that actually recycled?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to happen?
It's going to happen to a certain extent. That the devil is in the details, and that we still need to, there's a lot of fight for us, and that's why I'm here.
Thank goodness, right? So some quick tips on what people can do. I mean, I know, carrying reusable, we don't need to use straws and all these kind of, one-use kind of use it and toss it, but any bigger picture tips that you can give us, perhaps voting, donating, like what are some of the more tangible things that we can do to change our habits?
Well, in general, like voting works well. We vote for the environment, and so I will vote for whoever has the best plan to fix the problems around the environment. I think donating to associations and organizations that try to shift towards more environmentally sustainable practices. Well, Environmental Defense is an organization that does advocacy and public campaigning. So obviously donations are also welcome. But in general, I would also like to add that it would be important for people that want to see change, is to express it.
Sure.
So, I do that periodically, and even before working here, I would email or call a company and say, like, why are you packaging eggs in plastics? Like, we've always done it in paper. Why are you doing it in plastics? And just voice the concern and try to get more, the companies to shift to more reusable options or to less packaging. So I think expressing concern, apart from living there's a lot of easy tips to reduce your plastic consumption. Like, I think the easiest one that I did already over 10 years ago was to shift to plastic soap bars, and which come without any packaging at all. Exactly. And so like that's a pretty easy one. Or going for refillable shampoo bottles, like from my local shop, and most of the times, like, these shops that offer these solutions are also offer local alternatives. Mm-hmm. And so they are you're doing a good thing in many ways.
Yeah, I love that tip on opening the conversation. Sometimes when you go into your grocery store and you see one organic pepper wrapped in plastic, you're like, why is this organic pepper wrapped in plastic? So having that conversation with your local grocer, and I think people are afraid to do that, but I think the more we can open that conversation up and ask places that we shop at, and we are supporting them to support us as well in trying to make that difference. I just have one more question. It might be a doozy, but what is your opinion on the relationship between climate change and plastic production?
It's massive. The plastic industry often tells us that plastics are a way to fight climate change, but it's a one-sided argument. Think about milk. Glass is surely heavier, but here in Canada we drink mainly local milk. It doesn't have to travel that much, and therefore the footprint is lower. If we're thinking about water being bottled and coming from France or coming from Italy, well, then the plastic footprint is the footprint of glass is higher. But do we need bottled water coming from another country when we have taps? So that's one. But plastic and climate change have a big relationship, because also plastic is made of fossil fuels. And while we're shifting more to renewable sources of energy, the petrochemical industry is looking at other ways to use those fossil fuels, and plastic is their preferred way. There are studies that say that by 2040 or 2050, like 15 to 20% of greenhouse gas emissions may come from plastics. So that's a huge contribution, and therefore, like shifting away from plastics and reducing plastics is also a way to reducing our carbon footprint.
Monumentally, right?
Oh yeah.
Are there surprising statistics, very quickly as we wrap up, that Canadians might be surprised to know when it comes to plastic?
I think the biggest shock for Canadians was this incredibly low number of plastic being recycled, which is estimated being around 9% of all the plastic waste that is generated in Canada. Talking about the recycled plastic, we know that also that about 35% of the recycled plastic is exported to developed country, or used to be. So we don't really know if that 35% was actually recycled. So that 9% may be even lower. The other fact that I found on a report that I found quite interesting is that Canadians are the biggest users of plastic per capita. Like I think it's Canada and South Korea are the biggest consumers of plastics in the world.
I read that too.
So I don't think it's something necessarily to be proud of, and as we like to say, we can do better.
Well, Vito, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. People can find all of your amazing information on your website, which is environmentaldefense.ca.
Yeah.
And of course, you can also check out the ecohub.ca for lots of different ways that you can reduce your plastic use.
Thanks for having me.